This video discusses the carbon cycle and how carbon can move through the spheres. By the time we're done with this video, you should be able to see how the carbon cycle and oxygen cycle are related, where carbon is stored in each sphere, and the different processes that can either add or remove carbon from the different spheres. So here we go. First, let's see what you already know. In your notes, you need to draw a landscape that has trees, grass, a body of water, the atmosphere, and a factory. A couple of animals would be good as well. Your goal is to label the processes that move carbon from place to place, along with drawing arrows showing where the carbon starts and where it ends for each process. So take some time, pause the video, and try your best. Once you're stuck, click play. So this is my beginning for my carbon cycle. I'm going to start with combustion, which happens in factories or in your car or something like that. Burning of fossil fuels. What that's going to do is going to add more carbon into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Now that carbon in the atmosphere can then be transferred to plants through the process of photosynthesis. The carbon is now moving from the atmosphere to the biosphere. Now once in the biosphere, the plants can then decompose. So they die, decompose, you got decomposing bacteria. Then transferring the carbon that's in the biosphere into the geosphere. Also, when decomposition happens, carbon is released into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Animals also do a process called respiration, which can add carbon to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Now, the carbon that's been transferred to the geosphere through decomposition, that turns into fossil fuels, which can then get mined by humans into our factories or into our cars. And then, a whole combustion thing can happen again. But let's go back to the the biosphere. It's in the plants. Herbivores can eat those plants. So now the carbon went from a plant to an animal, and then an animal, like my little raccoon there, can be eaten by other animals through the food chain. So carbon is transferred from place to place to place within the biosphere through the food chain. Again, those animals can then decompose as well. Now, what can happen is there's dissolved carbon, just like there's dissolved oxygen. There's dissolved carbon in bodies of water. That can be released into the atmosphere through the process of diffusion. And remember, diffusion can go both ways. So diffusion can release carbon into the atmosphere, and diffusion can also pull carbon out of the atmosphere and into bodies of water. So that's diffusion. So that's just a quick little carbon cycle diagram. Now that we have a basic understanding of the carbon cycle, let's take a look at where carbon can be stored. The atmosphere holds carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. When carbonate rocks, such as limestone, are weathered and eroded, the carbon that used to be in the rocks can get into the hydrosphere, creating carbonic acid. When dead organic matter decomposes in aquatic ecosystems, that carbon can also turn into carbonic acid. The geosphere can also hold carbon in the form of dead organic matter and fossil fuels like coal you see in the picture. Like we've discussed before, carbon is essential to life, similar to nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. All of life you see is mainly made up of carbon bonded with various other elements. The basic building blocks of cells, DNA, is composed of a lot of carbon. What this means is that the biosphere contains a large amount of carbon. Very quickly, let's take some time to pause the video and review the different forms of carbon. Make sure to be very specific. And you want to figure out the different types of carbon in each of the 4 spheres. When you're finished, press play. If you remember back to the phosphorus cycle and how phosphorus moved through the spheres, you should remember that there was a fast and slow part of the phosphorus cycle. Carbon cycle is rather similar. As you can see in the diagram, carbon tends to move very quickly through the biosphere and through burning of vegetation and fossil fuels. The slowest part of the carbon cycle involves the movement of carbon between the hydrosphere and the geosphere. This should really make a lot of sense. If you think about it, the life cycle of anything in the biosphere is going to be much shorter than any process found in the hydrosphere and geosphere. Carbon can also be released from certain spheres into the atmosphere. You and all other organisms that breathe oxygen release carbon into the atmosphere through the process of respiration. Respiration rates do not really have a negative impact on the atmosphere compared to some of the other processes we will discuss. Carbon can also be released into the atmosphere through the process of decomposition. When humans mine and then burn any type of fossil fuel, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Burning of fossil fuels has really changed the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Same with slash and burn. Slash and burn occurs when humans cut down forests or plants or anything, any type of vegetation, and then burn that vegetation to make room for urban areas. There are natural processes that will also release CO2 into the atmosphere. The process of diffusion between the air and the water can exchange CO2. Very destructive volcanic eruptions, such as the eruption of Mount St. Helens, can also release large amounts of CO2. On the flip side of things, there are natural processes that will take out CO2 from the atmosphere. Most importantly is the process of photosynthesis. The oceans can also change the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. The colder the water, the more CO2 the water can hold. This also means warmer water releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. Finally, the biosphere, especially aquatic organisms with shells, will use carbon to make those shells. So it'll pull carbon out of the atmosphere. As I discussed earlier, the carbon cycle can be divided into slow and fast processes. Whenever we talk about the geosphere, we're talking about processes such as weathering and erosion that are very, very slow. Because of these slow processes, carbon can get locked in the geosphere for quite some time. Two types of rocks that store or hold a lot of carbon are limestone, which Minnesota has a lot of, and coal. The forms of carbon found within each type of rock is slightly different. Limestone is composed of calcium carbonate, which precipitates or turns into a solid, sometimes in water, whereas coal is created from decomposing organic matter. This diagram illustrates how partially decayed organic plant matter can slowly turn into coal with the addition of heat and pressure. Once carbon is locked within the geosphere, it typically stays there for a long period of time. Humans, however, have found that fossil fuels, which are rich in carbon, are great sources of energy. Since this discovery, humans have been extracting all forms of fossil fuels from the geosphere, which then alters the balance of where carbon is stored and how long carbon stays in certain spheres. The fast carbon cycle is mainly driven by biological processes such as photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition. As you may know, the process of photosynthesis happens in the leaves of plants. Plants take energy from the sun along with CO2 from the atmosphere and water to create glucose, which is sugar, and then also oxygen, which we then can breathe. Take a look at the diagrams you see on the screen and see if you can answer the questions on the right. Pause the video to answer the questions. When you're ready, press play to resume. The more photosynthesis is happening, the less CO2 there is in the atmosphere. What this means is that CO2 levels swing from high concentrations to low concentrations on a yearly basis. During spring and summer, plants are doing more photosynthesis, drawing down CO2 levels. However, during the fall and winter, the opposite is true. and CO2 levels will increase. Respiration, or breathing, takes the glucose, or sugar, that organisms get when they eat, along with oxygen from the air, and turn it into CO2, water, and energy. The burning of fossil fuels can also release CO2 into the atmosphere, increasing greenhouse gases and therefore also increasing global temperatures. The process of decomposition also involves carbon. As we discussed when talking about eutrophication, when decomposers break down organic matter, they use up oxygen. What we did not discuss is that at the same time, they are releasing CO2. So the more decomposition, the more CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's that. So what you need to do is make sure you're able to answer the summary questions 1, 2, and 3. Do that in your notes. Take time to rewatch parts of this video if you need to. And hopefully you got something out of this. Thanks, guys.